A dark-skinned woman in a wheelchair got stuck in an elevator and gave birth to twins right there. But a billionaire who happened to be nearby did something that changed their life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. Naomi Brooks woke before the sun, as she often did, her body roused not by restfulness, but by discomfort. The mattress beneath her was thin, its springs long past their prime, and though she shifted often during the night to find a tolerable position, she rarely succeeded. At 28 years old, she felt decades older. She stretched her arm, brushing against the cool metal of her wheelchair beside the bed, and with a sigh prepared herself for the routine that had become both her burden and her lifeline. Every movement took effort. She swung her legs carefully over the edge, feeling the familiar emptiness in them, the reminder of the accident that had taken her ability to walk 3 years earlier. Her hands found the armrests of the chair with practiced precision, and she pushed herself across the short space with the upper body strength she had honed through necessity. Her breath came shallow for a moment, but she steadied it, fixing her gaze on the cracked ceiling above. Today was another day of work. Today was another day closer to the birth of her children. Her children. Even as fatigue weighed heavy in her bones, the thought softened her. She rested her palms on her swollen stomach and whispered to the little lives inside. "One more day. Just one more delivery," she murmured, her voice cracked with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She wanted nothing more than to rest, but she couldn't afford that luxury. Rent, utilities, groceries. Those did not pause for her discomfort or for the miracle of the lives she carried. And Marcus, the man who should have been there beside her, had disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant. Not ready for responsibility, he had said with eyes that avoided hers, before walking out of her life. She had not seen him since. So she worked. She worked as a courier, even at 9 months pregnant, because it was the only job that allowed her some degree of flexibility, the only one she had managed to hold on to after the accident. It was hard enough for a woman in a wheelchair to find employment in a city like New York. Add late pregnancy to the equation, and the odds became nearly impossible. But Naomi had never been one to crumble under impossibility. She would endure. She always had. She dressed in her uniform slowly, tugging the navy blue shirt over her belly with effort until the buttons strained. Her pants were loose but functional, chosen more for comfort than appearance. She slipped her arms into her jacket, tucked the day's delivery envelopes into her courier bag, and finally pulled her hair back into a simple bun. The mirror offered her reflection. Dark circles under her eyes, lips dry, posture weary. Yet somewhere beneath the fatigue, a stubborn light still burned. The city greeted her with its usual indifference. The subway ride into Manhattan was crowded, a press of bodies that ignored her presence even as she maneuvered her chair into the tight spaces. No one offered her a seat. No one even met her gaze. She lowered her eyes and endured, clinging to the rhythm of the train as it hurtled toward the day's tasks. By the time she rolled onto the sidewalk near her first delivery, her back ached and sweat beaded on her temples. But she pressed on as she always did, stop after stop, signature after signature, hour after hour. By noon, she had completed most of her deliveries. The last one waited, looming in her thoughts all morning. Wexley Tower, one of the tallest and most prestigious buildings in Manhattan. She had been dreading it, not only because it stood at the farthest point of her route, but because every time she entered its gleaming glass doors, she felt as though she did not belong. She imagined the executives staring down at her from their offices, calculating profits that eclipsed everything she could ever earn in a lifetime. Yet she also knew she had no choice but to go. Work was work, no matter the setting. When she reached the tower, the scale of it overwhelmed her, as it always did. Its mirrored walls reflected the sky, the city, and the constant stream of polished shoes and briefcases that swept past. Naomi adjusted her courier badge and approached the front desk. The security guard barely glanced at her before directing her toward the express elevator on the right. She rolled forward, her bag heavy on her lap, her stomach tightening uncomfortably as she maneuvered onto the polished floor. The elevator doors opened, and she guided herself inside, pressing the button for the 47th floor. The doors began to close, and she exhaled in relief at the brief solitude only, for a hand to thrust itself between the panels. "Hold it, please," came a voice low and commanding. The doors slid back and in stepped a man in a tailored suit, his attention fixed on the tablet in his hand. Naomi's heart stumbled when she recognized him. Caleb Weston, the CEO of Weston Enterprises. His face had appeared countless times in magazines and news articles, always framed by words like visionary, ruthless, uncompromising. In person, he seemed younger than she expected, early 30s perhaps, his posture confident yet distracted. His hair was neatly trimmed, his features strong and symmetrical, his presence the kind that filled a room without effort. He glanced briefly at her, nodded politely, then returned to his screen. She pressed herself slightly back in her chair, as if to make herself smaller, though there was no true hiding place in the confined elevator. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet hum of ascent. Floor 10, floor 20, floor 30. Naomi tried to focus on her breathing, but a sudden rush of warmth between her legs made her stiffen. At first she thought, mortified, that she had lost control of her bladder, but then the realization struck like lightning. Her water had broken. "Oh no," she gasped, clutching the railing. The elevator lurched violently, then halted between floors. The main lights flickered and died, leaving them in dim emergency glow. Caleb Weston lowered his tablet, frowning. "Perfect timing," he muttered, reaching for the emergency phone. That was when he saw Naomi's face contorted in pain, her knuckles white on the metal rail. "Are you all right?" His tone shifted instantly from irritation to concern. Naomi shook her head, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. "My water just broke," she whispered. "The baby's coming. Now." For a moment Caleb stood frozen, as though his mind could not reconcile the woman in the wheelchair, the claustrophobic elevator, and the urgency of her words. But then the shock burned away, and he knelt beside her, his voice calm though his hands trembled slightly. "Okay," he said. "Let's not panic. We'll get through this." He lifted the emergency phone, but no signal reached. He tried his cell next, scowling when the screen showed nothing. They were trapped. Naomi let out a cry as a contraction seized her, her body folding forward in pain. Caleb set aside his phone and moved to her side, guiding her gently to sit lower in her chair. He removed his suit jacket, folding it quickly to form a makeshift cushion behind her back. "I'm Caleb," he said, almost automatically, though she already knew. "I know," Naomi forced through clenched teeth. "Naomi." "Naomi Brooks." "Naomi," he repeated as though anchoring himself with her name. "I'm going to help you through this." The contractions came faster. Naomi's body shook with the force of them, her hands gripping his until her nails dug into his skin. To her surprise, he did not pull away. He leaned close, his breath steady, guiding her to match his rhythm. In that cramped space, with emergency lights casting shadows across the steel walls, a billionaire and a struggling courier found themselves bound by the oldest and rawest act of humanity: birth. When the moment came, Naomi screamed with a strength she did not know she still possessed, and Caleb, abandoning all pretense of composure, held his hands ready. The baby slid into the world, fragile and slippery, and for one suspended second the silence was unbearable, until a sharp, defiant cry filled the elevator. "It's a boy," Caleb said, his voice unsteady, eyes wide with wonder. He removed his silk tie and used it to secure the cord, then stripped off his shirt and wrapped the infant carefully before placing him in Naomi's arms. Her tears flowed freely as she cradled her son against her chest. The elevator jolted, the lights brightened, and with a shudder they began to move again. When the doors opened onto the 47th floor, they were met by a stunned crowd of executives and security personnel. Paramedics rushed forward, guiding Naomi gently onto a stretcher, but she refused to release her baby until Caleb himself promised he would stay. "Will you come with us?" she asked, fear flickering in her eyes. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course." In the ambulance, he sat beside her, his white undershirt stained, his hands raw and trembling, no longer the image of a flawless tycoon, but something far more real. Naomi, though consumed by exhaustion, felt the strange certainty that her life had just shifted in a way she could not yet comprehend. Hours later at the hospital, after the doctors had taken her son for examination, she was told another surprise awaited her. A second child had been born, a girl who had been hidden during every ultrasound. Twins, Elias and Ella. Naomi wept again, this time not from pain but from awe. When she awoke from her brief sleep, Caleb Weston was still there, waiting outside her room. He entered awkwardly, unsure of his place, but his eyes softened when they landed on the sleeping infants. Naomi smiled faintly. Though her body ached, her spirit felt strangely lighter. This was not how she had imagined giving birth, not in a broken elevator, not with a stranger, and certainly not with a man like him. Yet as she watched Caleb lean down to look at her children with quiet reverence, she could not deny what had happened. In the space between the 39th and 40th floors of a tower that symbolized everything unattainable, she had found unexpected strength and perhaps the faint beginning of a bond that would alter everything. The hours that followed the elevator ordeal blurred into a haze of medical staff, monitors, and paperwork. Naomi drifted in and out of shallow sleep, lulled by the soft cries of her newborns and the steady rhythm of hospital machines. She had expected to wake alone, as she always did, but each time she opened her eyes, she saw him there. Caleb Weston, still in his blood-stained undershirt, sitting rigidly in a plastic chair that looked entirely unworthy of his presence. He did not belong in the fluorescent light of a maternity ward, surrounded by the muted hum of exhausted mothers and their fragile infants. Yet somehow here he was, and the incongruity of it made Naomi's head spin. In the first days after the birth, reality began to settle in like the slow weight of dawn creeping across a room. Naomi now had 2 babies, not one. The doctors explained gently that a twin had been missed on earlier scans, hidden behind her brother. It was not unheard of, they reassured her, though it was rare. She barely had time to process the shock before nurses brought both children to her arms. Elias and Ella, tiny, helpless, demanding. Their cries pierced her exhaustion, but their warmth against her chest filled a hollow space she had not realized had grown so deep inside her. She had expected to face this alone, to steel herself for the lonely nights and endless responsibilities. But she was not alone. Caleb returned again and again, each visit surprising her more than the last. At first she assumed it was politeness, a lingering obligation born from the bizarre intimacy they had shared in the elevator. He had been there, after all, when her son first cried. He had held her hand through the worst pain of her life. She told herself he would eventually vanish back into his world of skyscrapers and negotiations, leaving her to hers. And yet, he kept coming. He brought baskets overflowing with supplies diapers stacked like towers, soft blankets in pastel shades, tiny bottles lined up in rows. Naomi's small hospital room began to resemble a baby store, and while she was grateful, she could not suppress the unease that grew each time more boxes arrived. She did not want to feel like a charity case. She had lived her life scraping by, patching holes in her own clothes, bargaining with landlords, enduring indignities that hardened her against pity. Accepting help was a language she did not know how to speak. The night before her discharge, she finally found the strength to confront him. Her voice was soft but firm, her gaze steady despite her fatigue. "This is too much." Caleb only raised an eyebrow, glancing at the mountain of packages spilling into the hallway. "The chairs?" he asked, motioning to a pair of rocking chairs recently delivered. "You mentioned your back was sore." Naomi's frustration welled up, sharper than she intended. "You can't keep buying things for us. I'm not some project for you to fix." For a moment his expression flickered, a mixture of hurt and restraint, before softening into something quieter. "I know you're not," he said gently. "I want to help. Is that so wrong?" She had no answer. He was not scolding, nor arrogant, nor dismissive. His tone carried no condescension. If anything, there was a strange sincerity she had not expected from a man the world painted as ruthless. The babies interrupted the tension, crying in perfect synchrony, as if unwilling to let their mother dwell in confrontation. Caleb rose immediately, crossing the room with surprising confidence. Naomi watched in disbelief as he lifted both infants, settling one in the crook of each arm. Just 2 weeks earlier, She had watched him fumble with their fragile bodies, awkward as a man trying to read a book in a language he did not speak. Now he held them with a steadiness that startled her, rocking gently as though he had been practicing in secret. At home, reality bore down harder. Naomi's apartment, already cramped, felt suffocating with 2 bassinets, stacks of diapers, and the constant chorus of cries. Nights blurred into days. Days blurred into nights. Yet Caleb's presence threaded through them like an anchor. He came daily, sometimes with takeout containers, sometimes with nothing at all, content to hold the babies while Naomi showered or simply sat in silence. He changed diapers, prepared bottles, learned to distinguish between Elias's sharp wails and Ella's softer protests. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms now bent over a changing table, sleeves rolled, sweat dampening his collar, determination etched across his face. Naomi could not ignore the shift in her own heart. She found herself waiting for his knock, noticing the ease with which her children settled in his arms, the way his deep voice soothed them. She told herself it was convenience, that any help was welcome, but beneath that logic stirred a truth she feared to name. She trusted him. More than that, she began to rely on him. Their conversations grew longer as exhaustion stripped away pretense. They sat on her small balcony after the twins had finally fallen asleep. The city stretched endlessly before them. In those moments, he shed his armor, confessing things that surprised her. He spoke of the board pressuring him to cut costs, to shut down smaller divisions and community programs. She had imagined him immune to doubt, but in the low glow of streetlights, his words carried vulnerability. He admitted he once believed business was only numbers, clean and simple, until recently. Now, holding her children, the arithmetic seemed different. Naomi studied him in those quiet hours. He was not what she expected, not the polished caricature of wealth from glossy magazines, nor the untouchable figure her imagination had painted. He was a man burdened by responsibility, drawn suddenly into a life where his decisions rippled into flesh and blood consequences. She told him as much once, half teasing. "You're not what I thought you'd be." He smiled faintly, a shadow in his expression. "Is that a good thing?" She deflected, unwilling to answer directly, but her heart already knew. For all the warmth budding between them, tension lay coiled beneath. The hospital called one morning to reschedule her postpartum appointment. The receptionist explained politely, apologetically, that the prenatal program had been cut, reorganized under new management. The earliest appointment available at another clinic was 3 weeks away. Panic spiked in Naomi's chest. She had chosen Riverside Hospital for its program, using precious savings for access. Now, with twins at home and her body still healing, she was told to wait, to fall in line with cost-saving measures. Her frustration grew into dread when she found the article. Riverside Hospital had been acquired by Weston Health Solutions, a subsidiary of Caleb's empire. The program was being slashed, its sliding-scale services eliminated. Hundreds of women, many like her, would be left without care. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief, her stomach knotting. The man who had held her babies, who had spent nights assembling their cribs, was the same man whose company was dismantling the very support system that had kept her alive. When Caleb arrived that evening, carrying dinner and a stuffed animal, she could not look at him the same way. The words spilled out before she could soften them. Did he know? Did he understand what his decisions cost? His face shifted from confusion to recognition, then concern. He admitted it was a board decision, part of the streamlining measures he had mentioned on her balcony. He had not realized she was a patient there. She told him that was not the point. The point was that his company's choices hurt people, mothers fighting to survive. He ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically unsettled. "You're right," he said quietly after a long pause. "I could have paid more attention. I should have." His honesty stilled her anger for a moment, but disappointment lingered. Intentions did not matter when women like her were left without care. The twins began to cry again, their voices slicing through the heavy silence. Naomi rose to tend to them, her back stiff, her words sharp. She told him she needed space, that he should leave. He did not argue. He only nodded, his face shadowed by something she could not name, and stepped out into the night. For the first time since that elevator, Naomi felt utterly alone. She held Elias and Ella close, rocking slowly in the chair he had insisted on buying, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something extraordinary, but reality had reminded her of its teeth. Billionaires did not belong in her world, and men like Caleb Weston did not choose women like her. Yet as she wept in the dim light of her apartment, she could not shake the memory of his hands steadying hers in that elevator, or the way he had looked at her children as though they were his own. It was that contradiction, the ruthless CEO and the man who had whispered encouragement into her ear as life entered the world, that haunted her most of all. And somewhere deep inside, a question stirred. Which version of him was real? The days that followed Caleb's departure were heavy and restless, filled with the constant demands of 2 infants and the silence of an apartment that suddenly felt emptier than it had before. Naomi had always assumed she would raise her children alone. She had prepared herself for that reality when Marcus walked away, leaving nothing behind but bitterness and unanswered questions. Yet in the weeks after the elevator incident, Caleb had slipped into her life with a steadiness that had felt almost natural, as though he had always been meant to be there. His absence now struck her harder than she would admit. The nights grew longer, the twins more demanding, and Naomi found herself straining under the weight of exhaustion. Every feeding, every diaper, every cry landed heavier because she knew the chair at the corner of her kitchen table would remain empty. She tried not to think about him, but he lingered everywhere. She noticed the crib he had assembled, the diapers he had bought, the rocking chair that bore the imprint of his presence. Every item whispered of his care, even as anger simmered beneath her skin. She could not forgive so easily what his company had done. It was one thing to bring her meals and hold her babies, quite another to preside over decisions that robbed countless women of the care they needed to survive. She told herself that walking away from him had been necessary, an act of self-respect. Yet late at night, when both Elias and Ella finally slept, she felt the loneliness pressing in around her, a loneliness she had spent years armoring herself against, but which now broke through every crack. 3 days later, the phone rang with news that startled her. The hospital was reinstating its prenatal and postpartum program, effective immediately, supported by a sudden influx of funding. She blinked at the words, struggling to make sense of them. When she pressed for details, the receptionist could only tell her that an anonymous donor had provided the money to keep the program alive. Naomi's heart stuttered. She did not need to be told who it was. When Caleb appeared at her door that evening, she stood frozen for a moment before letting him in. He looked less polished than usual, his tie askew, his eyes heavy as though he had not slept in days. He did not begin with excuses. He simply told her the truth, that he had gone to the board, overturned their decisions, restored the program not only at Riverside, but at several other clinics under Weston Health Solutions. It had been a fight, he admitted, but one worth taking on. For once, the language of profit and efficiency had been drowned out by something else. The memory of a woman in a wheelchair giving birth in his arms, and the knowledge that his signature could decide whether others like her received care or were cast aside. Naomi wanted to resist the pull of his words, but the sincerity in his eyes made it impossible. She saw the toll it had taken on him, not just politically, but personally. She believed him when he said it was no longer about obligation or guilt, but conviction. She realized then that he was changing, reshaping himself in ways she had never thought a man of his power could. For the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe. But as their bond deepened, so too did the shadows around them. Naomi had grown used to whispers in her neighborhood, the glances of strangers, the unkind assumptions that came with being a black woman, raising children alone in a wheelchair. Yet the scrutiny intensified once word spread that she was connected to Caleb Weston. Neighbors began to gossip. Headlines appeared online with photos of them together. It was not long before opposition stirred within the very halls of Weston Enterprises. Victor Harrington, a longtime member of the board and an ally of Caleb's late father, was the first to confront him. Victor had never approved of Caleb's leadership style, finding him too idealistic at times and too reckless at others. The idea that Caleb was now entwined with a woman like Naomi, an outsider with no pedigree, no money, and a past that could easily be painted as scandalous, was intolerable. Victor's words dripped with disdain as he warned Caleb that sentiment had no place in business and that shareholders would not tolerate distractions. When his warnings failed, he turned his attention to Naomi. It happened one afternoon when she returned from a rare walk with the twins, maneuvering her chair slowly up the ramp to her building. A man in a press suit stood waiting near the entrance. He introduced himself smoothly as a representative of Weston Enterprises, though Naomi knew at once whose errand he was running. He offered her a deal, his voice polite but cold, a substantial sum of money, enough to raise her children comfortably for years if she agreed to distance herself from Caleb permanently. For a moment, Naomi was stunned into silence. Then fury rose within her, hot and sharp. She told him to leave, her voice shaking with rage. And when he did not move quickly enough, she rolled forward and forced him to step aside. The insult cut deep. They had seen her as a problem to be erased, as if she were some inconvenience that could be bought off like an unwanted property. Her anger had barely cooled when another storm appeared. Vanessa, Caleb's former fiancée, returned into his orbit. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed, she represented the world Naomi imagined Caleb had once belonged to, exclusively a world of gala dinners, magazine covers, and polished appearances. Vanessa made no attempt to hide her disdain. She appeared at a charity event where Caleb and Naomi were photographed together and later sought Naomi out, her words smooth as silk but sharp as blades. She told her that she was temporary, a phase Caleb would outgrow once the novelty wore off. "Men like him don't stay with women like you," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. The encounters left Naomi shaken, though she tried not to show it. For all her strength, doubts gnawed at her. She knew the precariousness of her place in Caleb's world. She had no wealth, no power, no spotless history. She had grown up shuffled through foster homes after her mother's addiction spiraled and her father disappeared. She had known hunger, fear, neglect. And later, in her teenage years, she had clung to the wrong people in her desperate search for belonging. Marcus had been one mistake among many, his criminal record a shadow she could never quite escape. These were truths she had buried, carried in silence, hoping they would remain hidden. But she knew men like Victor could dig them up easily, twisting them into weapons. When she confessed all of this to Caleb, her voice low, her hands trembling as she cradled her sleeping daughter, she expected the worst. She expected him to recoil, to see her not as the strong woman he admired, but as the broken girl she had once been. But he did not. Instead, he listened, his eyes steady, his hand covering hers with quiet conviction. He told her that her past did not frighten him, that the very fact she had survived it only deepened his respect for her. For the first time, Naomi allowed herself to believe him, but Victor was relentless. He leaked fragments of her past to the press, hinting at scandal, painting her as an opportunist. Headlines appeared, "Weston heiress-in-waiting has troubled past," and, "From foster homes to fortune, who is Naomi Brooks?" Reporters lingered outside her apartment, cameras flashing as she tried to navigate her wheelchair with 2 babies in tow. Strangers online debated her worth, her character, her motives, as though she were an abstract figure and not a living, breathing woman fighting to care for her children. The pressure was suffocating, and Naomi considered retreating, hiding until it all blew over. But then she looked at Elias and Ella, their small faces turned toward her with blind trust, and she knew she could not shrink away. If she hid, if she allowed others to tell her story, then her children would grow up learning shame where there should be pride. So she made a decision that terrified her. She would speak. She would stand before the press and reveal her story in her own words, not as a weapon twisted by others, but as truth carried by her own voice. Caleb supported her, though she could see his fear for her in the lines around his mouth. He offered to shield her, to fight the battles himself, but she refused. This was hers to claim. On the day of the conference, the room was packed with journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers. Naomi sat at the front, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The lights were blinding, the murmur of voices overwhelming. But when she began to speak, a calmness took root. She told them about her childhood, about the nights spent hungry, about her mother's battles and her own years in foster care. She spoke of the accident that had put her in the chair, of Marcus's betrayal, of the terror and wonder of giving birth in a broken elevator. She did not hide her mistakes. She laid them bare, not as excuses, but as proof of survival. The room was silent when she finished, not hostile, not mocking, silent with the weight of her truth. For the first time, she saw the cameras not as predators, but as witnesses. Her story was no longer something to be wielded against her. It was hers, claimed and spoken. As she rolled away from the podium, Caleb met her at the edge of the stage. His eyes shone with something she could not name but felt deeply. In that moment, Naomi realized she had crossed a threshold. She had faced the storm and emerged not weaker but stronger, not diminished but magnified. And though she knew the battles were far from over, she also knew that for the first time, she was no longer fighting them alone. The weeks that followed Naomi's public testimony felt like living in the eye of a storm that had, against all odds, begun to settle. Where she had expected ridicule or hostility, she found something else entirely. The press, ever hungry for scandal, was instead captivated by the authenticity of her words. They replayed clips of her speech with commentary that surprised her. Headlines shifted from suspicion to admiration, painting her not as a liability to Caleb Weston's reputation, but as a woman who had endured hardship and risen through it with resilience. For the first time, Naomi saw her story presented not as a chain meant to drag her down, but as an anthem of survival. The effect rippled outward in ways neither she nor Caleb could have anticipated. Advocacy groups reached out to her, some focusing on women's rights, others on disability justice or foster care reform. Letters poured into her inbox, many from women who had faced similar struggles, thanking her for giving voice to their pain and their strength. Naomi read them late at night when the twins finally slept, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that her words had touched others, fear of the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a courier in a worn-out uniform. She had become something more, an emblem of possibility, a living contradiction to every stereotype that had ever been pressed upon her. Caleb recognized this shift as well. He saw how the world was changing its gaze upon her, and in that change, he saw opportunity. Not the kind of opportunity he once measured in profits and charts, but the chance to build something lasting, something human. Together they began to sketch ideas, sitting at her kitchen table late into the night, Elias and Ella sleeping in bassinets nearby. What if Weston Enterprises could use its wealth and infrastructure to create programs not just for efficiency, but for people? What if the company could partner with hospitals to ensure mothers never had to choose between food and prenatal care, or invest in accessible housing for families like hers? For Caleb, it was the start of reimagining the legacy he would leave behind. For Naomi, it was the fulfillment of a vow she had made long ago, to make sure no child endured what she had. The board resisted, of course. Victor Harrington scoffed openly at the proposals, calling them sentimental folly. Yet after Naomi's press conference, after the flood of public support that rallied behind her, even the most hardened dissenters were forced to reconsider. Investors who had once sneered at humanitarian distractions now realized that aligning the company with Naomi's vision was not only ethically sound, but good for business. Public image mattered, and she had transformed theirs overnight. Caleb leveraged this shift with skill, presenting her not as an outsider, but as a partner, someone who had opened his eyes to realities he had once ignored. Through all of this, the bond between Naomi and Caleb deepened in ways both subtle and profound. There was no single moment when she decided to trust him again, no grand gesture that erased the doubts that had once plagued her. Instead, it was in the small things, the way he rose at 3 a.m. to soothe Ella's cries, the way he carried Elias against his chest with a tenderness that contradicted every ruthless headline, the way he listened, truly listened, when she spoke about her dreams and fears. For the first time in her life, Naomi felt she was not fighting alone. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where love was not a fleeting illusion, but a foundation. It was on a quiet evening, months after her public declaration, that Caleb knelt before her in the dim glow of her living room. The twins were asleep, the city humming faintly beyond the window. He spoke without preamble, without rehearsed poetry, his words plain but weighted with sincerity. He told her that she had given him more than he could ever repay. Not just children he adored, but a reason to be more than the man he had been. He asked her to marry him, not with promises of wealth or grandeur, but with the simple pledge that he wanted to build a life with her, to face every storm at her side. Naomi's answer came with tears she had not expected. She said yes, not because of the diamonds he could afford, or the empire he controlled, but because she believed him. She believed in the man who had stripped off his jacket in a broken elevator to catch her son, the man who had knelt in her cramped apartment to assemble a crib, the man who had chosen her truth over his board's comfort. She believed in him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in happiness. Their wedding was not the spectacle tabloids had predicted. There were no towering floral arrangements or celebrity guest lists. Instead, it was a gathering of those who mattered, friends she had made through advocacy work, colleagues of Caleb who had stood by him, neighbors who had watched her wheel down cracked sidewalks with groceries balanced on her lap. Most poignant of all, her mother came. Sober, trembling, desperate to make amends, she stood at the back of the ceremony until Naomi caught her eye and nodded. In that nod was forgiveness, not blind, not naive, but the acknowledgement of a woman who had fought her own demons and now sought a chance to be a grandmother. Naomi gave her that chance. The twins, dressed in tiny formal wear, were carried down the aisle before her, and when Naomi followed in her chair, escorted by Caleb's steady hand, there was not a dry eye among the guests. She had once feared she would never know family, never know stability, never know love. Now surrounded by the two children who were her heart and the man who had chosen her without hesitation, she felt the impossible had become real. After the wedding, life did not suddenly become easy. There were still sleepless nights, still arguments with the board, still doubts that crept in when Naomi remembered the shadows of her past. But there was also laughter endless, healing laughter that spilled from their home. There was the quiet joy of watching Caleb teach Elias to crawl across the living room floor, the tenderness of seeing Ella fall asleep on his chest. There was the strength of knowing that every battle, no matter how fierce, would be faced together. A year later, Wexley Tower stood transformed. The top floors still housed executives and boardrooms, but the lower levels had been repurposed into a community center, funded by a new foundation Naomi had helped create. There were playrooms for children, clinics for mothers, resource offices for families navigating foster care and disability challenges. The building that had once symbolized cold wealth now pulsed with life and purpose. On the lobby wall, a brass plaque gleamed, its inscription simple but profound. Here between the 39th and 40th floors, new life began. May every family find hope between the walls of this tower. Naomi stood before that plaque one morning, Caleb at her side, Elias and Ella tugging playfully at her hands. She traced the letters with her fingertips, remembering the fear, the pain, the uncertainty of that day. She remembered thinking she might not survive, that she might lose everything before it began. And yet from that place of terror had come not only her children, but a love she had never dared hope for. She turned to Caleb, their children's laughter echoing in the vast lobby, and in his eyes she saw the truth reflected back at her. They had been forged in crisis, bound by circumstance, but what they had built since was theirs by choice. It was family, not born of ease or privilege, but of grit, trust, and love. For Naomi, it was proof that even the most broken paths could lead to the most extraordinary destinations. For Caleb, it was the realization that the true measure of his legacy was not in profits or towers, but in the lives he touched. Together, they had rewritten the story of who they were. And as they left the tower that day, the city rising around them in all its unforgiving splendor, Naomi knew with unshakable certainty that she was no longer climbing alone. She had her children, she had her husband, she had herself. A woman once abandoned in every sense of the word had become the center of a family, a force strong enough to stand against empires. The elevator had not just carried her upward that night, it had carried her into a life she never imagined, a life where she was no longer surviving but rising. And as the doors of the tower closed behind them, she felt the future stretch wide and bright before her, a future she would claim with every ounce of strength she possessed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Click on the next video to keep watching and explore other stories on the channel you might have missed. And if you think someone else would love this too, be sure to share this video with your friends.